Hello, and welcome to week 19 in God's story of grace. This week we are exploring the book of Proverbs and the theme that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So, just as we get started, I'd like for us to reflect a little bit about the book of Proverbs as it is situated in the Old Testament. It is found more broadly in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, so it's grouped with books like Ecclesiastes and Job. And what it does is it provides us insight not only in the spiritual life and the journey that we're on with God, but it also has a lot of practical wisdom for how we conduct ourselves and how we make decisions and how we think about our values and the world in which we live. And it's a unique genre within the Old Testament, and it's also situated in an interesting place as well. We've spent some time already thinking about the kings of Israel, the united monarchy, the divided monarchy, and this wisdom literature is in a lot of ways connected with the time of the kings. Solomon is such a major figure as we think about Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. He was known for his wisdom, and it's interesting to think about what we can see in the book of Proverbs. Sometimes when we look at it, we might have a hard time discerning an overarching structure, and we might almost think of it as a disparate collection of wisdom sayings with a broad assortment of materials. But what I like to propose is that actually, when we read the book of Proverbs in light of the idea of covenant with God, a special covenant relationship that involves fear of the Lord and faithfulness, God's faithfulness to us and our faithfulness to God. When we read Proverbs in that light and think about the different sections in the book, that there actually is a thread throughout, and it wants to tie the search for wisdom and the embodiment of wisdom in with the spiritual journey, walking in step in the way of the God of Israel. So, just to mention a few details. So the book of Proverbs has some different sections. There's a prologue. We actually read for our reading plan this week chapters 1 and 2, chapters 8 and 9, and chapter 30. And so we'll be reflecting on each of those sections, but there is a prologue to the book of Proverbs. There's a section dealing with the wisdom of Solomon. There is a section 30 wisdom sayings, and a lot of research has been done that looks to these 30 sayings in connection with the wisdom, the traditions that the Israelites would have been exposed to when they were in Egypt, the kind of popular wisdom that was available at that time. And as they came out of Egypt and entered into the land of Canaan, they were aware of some of these sayings from their time in Egypt. And so there is a little bit of awareness that there is a kind of a discussion back and forth between some of the Egyptian wisdom sayings and some of the things that we find in the book of Proverbs. There was a very famous Egyptian pharaoh who had this book of wisdom. I always have trouble saying his name, Menemope, but he had this wisdom book with 30 sections. And in Proverbs chapter 22, there's these 30 wisdom statements. And so researchers have wondered how does that kind of parallel structure of these 30 statements and some similar content, how does it maybe show a little bit of a sharing or insight that the Israelites brought from their time in Egypt into their own kind of wisdom tradition? Now, once again, as we said at the beginning, all of the wisdom in the book of Proverbs is brought into the context of covenant relationship with the God of Israel. So any wisdom traditions that they would have borrowed from any of their contact with other peoples would have to fit within that framework or is brought into that framework of relationship with God. But in addition to that 30 wisdom saying section, there is another part attributed to Solomon. And in some ways, there is awareness that during the reign of King Hezekiah, that he was involved with a great renewal of awareness about the law and some of the older traditions of Israel that had been forgotten, and also a sense that he left his own mark on the book of Proverbs, that he was involved with a type of an editing or a renewal of interest in the book of his era. And so there's a second section with statements from Solomon, but there's this thought that Hezekiah had some impact on this other material. And then one of our readings this week from chapter 30, the words of Agur, this beautiful, humble prayer for this individual who is seeking after wisdom and wants to please God with their life. So we have Solomon, we have the influence of Hezekiah, we have some wisdom from Egypt, and we have the words of Agur in chapter 30, yet another person who has contributed to the sayings in the book of the Proverbs. And then finally in chapter 31, Lemuel, another contributor. So in all these ways, these different elements have been brought together in the book. And chapter 1 really helps us see the thesis statement of how these different sources were brought together. It says, in order to instruct and to lead us in a life that is pleasing to God, these proverbs are brought together to help us in how we live and how we seek to be pleasing to God. We see that early in chapter 1, and the whole foundation of that, and the whole foundation of understanding these proverbs is the fear of the Lord. A life pleasing to God is one lived with reverence towards God, where we recognize who God is and who we are, and that we keep God at the center of our world and don't put ourselves there. That's what the fear of the Lord really translates to, I believe, in the imagination of all those sages who are sharing with us in the book of Proverbs. They would tend to kind of find a concert or of agreement around that idea that wisdom is centered in this reverence towards God, keeping him at the center and not ourselves, and having that posture. And then when we have that posture, we're empowered to seek after wisdom, to live a life that is fulfilling. And that's a really beautiful thing. So just as we've taken that little time just to talk about Proverbs generally, I want to get into our specific readings. Chapter 1, as we already mentioned, lays out a thesis statement that we are called to this pursuit of wisdom and a life that is pleasing to God, and the reverence of God becomes the foundation for that type of life. In Hebrew, we have the phrase reshit. The word reshit means beginning. So we could say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But in Hebrew, the concept of beginning in that word reshit is also one of a foundation that is built upon. So we could almost translate it, the fear of the Lord is a foundational beginning of wisdom, or is a foundation for wisdom. We build upon that basic posture, and it informs all that we do. Then as we continue to go through chapter 1, we hear about the two ways that are available to us in life, a way that leads to prospering and flourishing and closeness with God, the way of wisdom, and then the way that leads to destruction and sorrow and loneliness, which is the way of folly. And as we move into chapter 2, that is unpacked a little bit more for us, and we're reminded to seek after wisdom, that it is an important pursuit. And there is an image that's used of Lady Wisdom. Wisdom is personified in a female way in the book of Proverbs. And Lady Wisdom is out calling on the streets, calling people to heed her words. And the book of Proverbs is trying to help us discern that voice in our lives, in the world around us, the voice of wisdom speaking, which really we can understand it as an extension of God's efforts to reach us, to call us in the right way. And then we have in chapter 9 this really interesting image of a feast. Lady Wisdom not only calls out, but she prepares a table. And the food at that table is available to us. And if we come and eat of it, it is nourishing to our souls and our bodies and our minds and gives us life. And then there's Folly, on the other hand, who also has a table. But at this table, the food is stolen, the drinks are stolen, and Folly tries to pitch the invitation as, come, even though it's stolen, it's still good. Even though it's not something that was acquired in the right way, you should still have it. And they represent these two tables, these two forms of eating represent this option, these two different paths of life, to We go and walk down the path of life and eat the foods at the table that give life? Or are we sitting at the table of essentially a food and a drink that is poisoned, that as we consume it, it slowly hurts us and kills us? And I'll just mention on this note, it's interesting to think about our contemporary world and ask the question, what are the foods at the table of folly in our contemporary world? And we probably could name quite a few relatively quickly. For example, in our digitally intensive, always connected state, where we get lots of quick micro videos and quick dopamine hits as we see entertaining content, or as we might find ourselves in some cases doom scrolling, looking at one story after the other. We are essentially, in those ways, sitting at the table where the food is poisoned. Slowly over time, it's hurting us and it's isolating us. And the call of wisdom is, how do we step back and choose what is life-giving, and how do we turn our attention towards God and eat the food that actually satisfies? And this is just a side note, but we've been on a journey this year as a church with our own experience of communion. We've been celebrating communion once a month and reflecting on what does it mean to sit at the Lord's table, or to stand at the Lord's table, or even to be a community around the church in a circle as we think of being at the Lord's table, and to receive the bread and the cup and to encounter Christ as we eat at his table together. What does that mean? How does that encounter change us and remind us of his love and his grace? And it really is the antidote and the solution to the hunger we have in a digital time where there is so much at stake and always calling to us and beckoning to us to give our attention to it and eat at the table of folly. But then in the midst of that, we are called to the Lord's table, and it brings us out of that mindset. And hopefully we can enter into a place where we stand before God and receive afresh our daily bread. Which brings us now to Proverbs chapter 30. And I love Proverbs chapter 30. I wrote a paper about it when I was in seminary, did a class presentation, and I've continued to come back to this chapter again and again. This beautiful, humble prayer from Agur, where he prays to God and says, God, I want to please you. Keep falsehood and lies far from my lips. Lord, I don't want to live with extremes. Keep me from poverty and keep me from riches. I don't want to be so poor that I would be tempted to steal so that I would have the food that I need. And I don't want to be so rich that I would forget about you. But instead, God, give me my daily bread, that which I really need. And as I receive that, I also am reminded of my dependence on you. And it's a beautiful prayer about balance and about dependence on God. And I think in a lot of ways, it is an embodiment of the principle of fear of the Lord. What does Agur say? He says, God, I don't want to make me the center of the universe. I want you to be the center. And in order to keep it that way, please don't give me too little or don't give me too much. Help me to have just the right amount so that I continue to depend on you and come to you, which in a lot of ways is like Jesus' prayer to us that he models in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. And it is just a beautiful connection that I've thought about over the years, how Jesus, when he teaches us to pray, helps us, like the perspective of Agur, to keep dependence on God at the center of our life and not put ourselves at the center. And also to keep that posture towards God, that we need God's provision and we look to God for that. We don't just try to serve ourselves or provide for ourselves. So the final part of our reading plan that I want to talk about is Proverbs chapter 8, which is a very interesting section of scripture where it talks about wisdom personified at the beginning of creation with God. As all things are being made and formed, wisdom is there with God. And in early Christian tradition, this personification of wisdom was also understood as a foreshadowing or a connection with the person of Jesus as the Son, the Word, who was with God at creation. And we know from John's Gospel that the Word was important in what God was doing, that all things were made through the Word. And so this idea of wisdom being at creation, Proverbs 8 is saying, look, wisdom is so important that even the very universe in which we find ourselves and in which we live is ordered by the principles of wisdom. Somehow those principles saturate the intricate details of the created order. And we're invited to come before God in awe and recognition of that, and to live our lives with that posture of humility where we say, thank you, God, for all these good gifts that you've given us. Help us to keep these things in proper perspective and to keep you at the center. So I want to thank you again for taking this time to journey with me through week 19 of our reading plan. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on Sunday during the sermon time, or if you want to share any thoughts with me directly when we see each other at church or through email, please do so. And until next time, goodbye.